Welcome to What If Sleep Storian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if, beneath towering glass and the hush of history, a mystery moved like a shadow, quiet, deliberate, and laced with riddles no ordinary mind could solve? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. The fog rolled through London like a living thing, soft and patient, wrapping itself around the lamppost with tender persistence. It was the kind of evening where time seemed to move like honey, thick and golden, each moment stretching into the next with gentle inevitability. The gas lamps flickered their warm yellow light through the mist, creating halos of comfort in the gathering dusk, and somewhere in the distance, the Thames murmured its ancient songs to the stones that lined its banks. In this world of shadows and whispers, where the scent of coal smoke mingled with the sweetness of pipe tobacco and the earthy dampness of autumn leaves, two men sat in comfortable silence. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing patterns across the worn Persian rug, and the leather of well-loved chairs creaked with the weight of contemplation. Dr. John Watson set down his pen with a soft sigh, the scratch of writing replaced by the gentle tick of the mantel clock. Across from him, in his familiar chair, Sherlock Holmes drew slowly on his pipe, the cherry tobacco glowing like a tiny star in the dim room. The smoke curled upward, lazy spirals that seemed to carry thoughts and dreams toward the ceiling, where shadows gathered like old friends sharing secrets. "Another quiet evening," Watson murmured, his voice barely disturbing the peaceful atmosphere. He could taste the hint of rain on the air that drifted through the slightly open window, could feel the soft wool of his waistcoat against his chest as he breathed in the calm of their sanctuary at 221B Baker Street. Holmes exhaled slowly, the smoke forming a gentle cloud that caught the firelight. "Quiet, yes," he said, his voice soft and contemplative. "But London is never truly silent, Watson. Listen. Can you hear it? The city's heartbeat steady and sure beneath the fog. And indeed, if one listened carefully, there were the distant sounds of hooves on cobblestones, the soft call of a night watchman, the gentle splash of water against the embankment. These sounds didn't intrude upon the peace, but rather enhanced it, like a lullaby sung by the city itself to its sleeping children. The warmth of the room seemed to wrap around them like a gentle embrace. Watson could feel the smooth texture of his teacup against his fingertips, still warm from the tea Mrs. Hudson had brought them an hour ago. The taste of bergamot lingered pleasantly on his tongue, mingling with the aromatic pipe smoke that filled the air with its soothing presence. It was then, in this moment of perfect tranquillity, that the soft knock came at their door. Not urgent or demanding, but gentle, almost hesitant, like a leaf tapping against a window in a mild breeze. Mrs. Hudson's voice drifted up from below, soft and musical in the evening air. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson? There's a gentleman to see you. Says it's rather important, though he's quite polite about it." Holmes and Watson exchanged a glance, the firelight catching in their eyes. There was no urgency in the moment, no sense of danger or alarm. Instead, there was simply the gentle curiosity that comes when a peaceful evening promises to unfold into something interesting, like a flower opening its petals to the moon. "Send him up, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes called softly, his voice carrying easily through the quiet house. "And perhaps you might bring some fresh tea." The footsteps on the stairs were careful and measured, and when their visitor appeared in the doorway, he seemed almost to emerge from the fog itself. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his dark hair like moonbeams through storm clouds. His clothes were well tailored but showed the gentle wear of a man who walked much in the London streets, and his eyes held a depth that spoke of both great learning and great sorrow. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice cultured and soft. "Dr. Watson. I am Dr. Gabriel Poole. I hope you'll forgive the lateness of my call, but I find myself in need of your unique perspectives. Holmes gestured to a chair near the fire, and Dr. Poole settled into it with the careful movements of a man carrying invisible burdens. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the lines of worry that creased his brow, and Watson noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson. "Take your time, Doctor Poole," Watson said gently, his medical training allowing him to recognise the signs of a man wrestling with difficult thoughts. "We're in no hurry this evening." Poole sipped his tea slowly, savouring the warmth, and when he spoke his words came like gentle waves lapping against a peaceful shore. "I was a colleague of Dr. Henry Jekyll. You may have heard the name, though the circumstances of his disappearance were kept quite private." The name settled into the room like dust motes in sunlight, visible but not disturbing. Holmes's pipe glowed more brightly as he drew upon it, and Watson felt the slight quickening of interest that comes when a mystery begins to reveal its first threads. "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "a brilliant chemist, if memory serves." There were whispers of unusual experiments, though nothing concrete ever came to light. "Whispers," Poole repeated, the word carrying weight like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes, there were always whispers around Henry. He was intense in his pursuits, passionate about understanding the nature of human consciousness, the boundaries between our civilized selves and our more primitive instincts." The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls, and outside the fog continued its gentle embrace of the city. Watson could smell the faint scent of lavender from Mrs. Hudson's cleaning, mixed with the leather of old books and the comforting aroma of Holmes's tobacco. "His disappearance was sudden," Poole continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a man telling a story by firelight. "One day he was there, working in his laboratory with that fervent energy he possessed, and the next, gone. His servants found his laboratory in disarray, chemicals spilled, papers scattered like leaves in an autumn wind." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. "And you believe he has returned?" Poole's hands tightened around his teacup, and Watson noticed the way the man's breathing had become slightly more rapid, though still controlled. "3 days ago, I received a letter. Henry's handwriting, unmistakable, though." He paused, reaching into his coat with careful movements. "Perhaps you should see for yourself." The letter he produced was written on expensive paper, but the edges were slightly crumpled, as if it had been handled many times with unsteady fingers. Holmes took it with his characteristic gentleness, holding it so that the firelight illuminated the writing without casting harsh shadows. The handwriting was indeed elegant, but there was something about it that seemed to writhe slightly in the dancing light, as if the very words were unsettled. Watson leaned closer, breathing in the faint scent of chemicals that clung to the paper like an unwelcome memory. "My dear Poole," Holmes read aloud, his voice soft and measured, "I write to you from a place between worlds, where the fog of consciousness meets the clarity of revelation. I have found it, Gabriel. The formula that unlocks the chambers of the human soul, that allows us to step outside the prison of our civilized selves and experience the pure, unfettered truth of our nature." Holmes paused, and in that silence, the fire seemed to whisper secrets to the shadows. Watson could feel the texture of his own breathing, the way the warm air filled his lungs and carried with it the mingled scents of their peaceful evening. "I have changed, my friend," the letter continued, "in ways that both terrify and exhilarate me. The substance I have created, it is beyond anything I achieved before. It doesn't merely separate the aspects of the self. It amplifies them, clarifies them, allows them to exist in their purest forms. I am no longer bound by the tedious compromises of ordinary existence." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and Watson found himself thinking of the way fog could sometimes make familiar streets seem strange and new, how it could transform the ordinary world into something altogether more mysterious. "But the effects," Holmes continued reading, "are unpredictable. Sometimes I am myself, sometimes I am other. And in those other moments I see the world with such clarity, such pure understanding, that the ordinary concerns of morality and convention seem like chains binding a bird that was meant to soar." Poole's breathing had become more visible in the cool air, small puffs of vapour that caught the firelight. "That was 3 days ago," he said softly. "Since then, there have been incidents, strange reports from Whitechapel and Suffolk. A man matching Henry's description, but changed, acting erratically, speaking to shadows, laughing at things that aren't there." Holmes set the letter down carefully, as if it were something fragile that might shatter at a harsh touch. "And you believe Dr. Jekyll has become unstable?" "I believe," Poole said, his voice carrying the weight of deep concern, "that Henry has created something beyond his ability to control, and I fear for what he might do, or what might be done to him, if he's found in his current state." The room fell into a gentle silence, the kind that comes not from emptiness but from fullness, from the weight of important thoughts settling like snow on a winter landscape. Watson could hear the soft whisper of ash settling in the fireplace, could feel the smooth surface of his chair's armrest beneath his palm. Holmes rose slowly, moving to the window where he stood silhouetted against the fog-shrouded street. His tall frame seemed to blend with the shadows, and when he spoke, his voice carried the thoughtful cadence of a man organising complex ideas into simple truths. "Dr. Poole," he said, his words soft but clear, "you speak of Dr. Jekyll as a friend. Tell us, what was he like? Not the scientist, not the researcher, but the man himself." Poole was quiet for a long moment, and Watson could see him searching through memories like pages in a beloved book. "Henry was contradictory," he said finally. "Brilliant, certainly, but also deeply troubled by the compromises we all make in civilized society. He once told me that he felt like an actor forced to play the same role every day, when inside him lived a dozen different characters, each with their own desires and impulses." The fog outside seemed to press closer to the windows, and Watson could imagine it seeping through the tiny gaps, bringing with it the scents of the London night. Coal smoke and river water, the distant aroma of pub dinners, and the clean smell of rain-washed stone. He was fascinated by the idea that we're not single beings, but collections of impulses and desires held together by the thin veneer of social expectation, Poole continued. He would often speak of authentic existence, of what it might mean to live without the constraints of conventional morality. Holmes turned from the window, his movement fluid and thoughtful. And his experiments were an attempt to separate these different aspects of the self, to allow them to exist independently. Poole's voice carried a note of sadness, like wind through autumn leaves. He believed that by understanding our divided nature, we might find a way to reconcile it, to live more honestly, more completely. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, and he pulled his coat closer around his shoulders. But something went wrong. Something went terribly wrong, Poole confirmed. The early experiments were successful in their way. Henry would take his formula and become someone else. Someone who shared his knowledge and memories, but not his inhibitions or moral constraints. He called this other self by the name of Edward Hyde. The name seemed to settle into the room like a weight, and Watson noticed how the fire's flames seemed to flicker more intensely for a moment, as if disturbed by an unfelt wind. Hyde was everything Henry felt he couldn't be, Poole said, his voice growing softer, more contemplative. Selfish, impulsive, free from the burden of conscience. At first, Henry viewed him almost as a liberation, a way to experience aspects of human nature that civilization had forced him to suppress. Holmes returned to his chair, moving with the careful grace of a man deep in thought. But Hyde grew stronger. "Yes," Poole whispered, the word barely audible above the fire's gentle crackling. Each transformation seemed to feed him, to make him more real, more substantial. And Henry began to change even when he wasn't taking the formula, as if Hyde was somehow bleeding through, contaminating his ordinary existence. The room had grown darker as the evening deepened, and the gaslight from the street cast ever softer patterns through the fog. Watson could taste the change in the air, the way the night seemed to thicken around them like a blanket being drawn over the city. "That was when Henry disappeared," Poole continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of remembrance. "One morning, his household found the laboratory destroyed, Chemicals everywhere, and both Henry and Hyde gone. We assumed he had finally lost control, that Hyde had taken over completely. But now he has returned, Holmes said gently, encouraging the narrative to continue flowing like a slow river toward its destination, with something new, something worse. Poole's hands trembled slightly as he set down his empty teacup. The formula he described in his letter. It's not the same substance he used before. This new compound doesn't just separate aspects of personality. It amplifies them beyond recognition, beyond control. Watson leaned forward, his medical curiosity overriding his sense of unease. What kind of effects are we talking about? Witnesses describe a man who shifts between personalities like shadows changing with the sun, Poole said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine fear. Sometimes he appears to be Henry, cultured, intelligent, speaking rationally about scientific matters, but then without warning he becomes something else, not Hyde, but something new, something that laughs at inappropriate moments, speaks to people who aren't there, claims to see truths that others cannot perceive. The fire had burned lower, and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard moving softly through the house below, her evening routine as comforting and predictable as the tide. Holmes reached for the poker and stirred the coals gently, sending sparks dancing up the chimney like tiny stars seeking the night sky. "And the incidents you mentioned?" Watson asked, his voice careful and professional. "A physician in Whitechapel reported treating a gentleman who claimed his blood was turning to silver and insisted on having it examined under a microscope to prove it. A shopkeeper in Southwark described a customer who purchased 3 different hats, claiming he needed one for each of his active personalities. And yesterday..." Poole paused, his breathing becoming more visible in the cooler air. "Yesterday?" Holmes prompted gently. "Yesterday, a constable found a man standing in the middle of Blackfriars Bridge at midnight, perfectly still, staring up at the stars. When approached, the man, who matched Henry's description exactly, began to weep and said that he could see the mathematical equations that governed the movement of the planets, and that the beauty of it was more than his mind could bear. The silence that followed was filled with the soft sounds of the evening, the distant clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, the gentle hiss of the gas lamps outside, the whisper of fog against the windows. Watson could feel his own heart beat, steady and reassuring, a reminder of the solidity of ordinary existence in a world that suddenly seemed much less certain. Holmes reached for his pipe again, but instead of lighting it, he simply held it, turning it slowly between his fingers as if it were a talisman against uncertainty. "Dr. Poole, what exactly are you asking us to do?" "Find him," Poole said simply, the words carrying the weight of desperate hope. "Find Henry before he truly loses himself to this new madness, or before ... He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Before someone decides he's too dangerous to remain free." Watson understood the implication immediately. In a world where madness was often met with harsh remedies, where asylums were filled with souls whose only crime was thinking differently, Dr. Jekyll's condition could easily be misunderstood as simple insanity, rather than the result of scientific experimentation gone awry. "The police?" Holmes asked. "Have been discreetly informed to watch for him, but they've been told he's suffering from a nervous breakdown brought on by overwork. Nothing about the chemical aspects of his condition." Poole's voice carried the weight of necessary deceptions. "If they find him in one of his altered states, they'll simply commit him to Bedlam or Bethlem, and he'll disappear into the asylum system forever." Holmes rose again, this time moving to his desk where he began to gather papers with the careful movements of a man preparing for a journey. "We'll need to move carefully. If Dr. Jekyll is indeed experiencing the effects you describe, approaching him directly could be dangerous. Not necessarily to us, but to him. A frightened or confused person can make unpredictable choices." Watson felt the familiar stirring of purpose that came when they took on a new case, but this time it was tempered by something else, a gentle melancholy for a man lost in the labyrinth of his own brilliant mind. "Where do we begin?" "With understanding," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying the wisdom of long experience with the complexities of human nature. "We need to see Henry's laboratory, examine his notes, and understand what he was attempting to achieve. Only then can we hope to predict where his current path might lead him. Poole nodded slowly, relief visible in the relaxation of his shoulders. His laboratory. I've maintained it exactly as it was found. Nothing has been disturbed. Then that's where we'll start, Holmes said, his voice gentle but decisive. But not tonight. Tonight, Dr. Poole, you should rest. Tomorrow's work will require clear thinking and steady nerves. Poole rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man carrying heavy thoughts. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot thank you enough. Henry's not just a colleague. He's one of the finest minds of our generation. If there's any chance of saving him from this affliction, then it must be taken. After Poole had departed, his footsteps fading into the fog-wrapped street below, Holmes and Watson sat in comfortable silence. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the room had taken on the peaceful dimness of late evening. Watson could smell the lingering traces of their visitor, a faint chemical scent that spoke of laboratories and experiments, mixed with the more ordinary aromas of wool and tobacco. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice soft in the gentle darkness. Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his pipe unlit between his fingers. When he spoke, his words came slowly, thoughtfully, like a man feeling his way through an unfamiliar landscape. "I think, Watson, that we are dealing with a man who has discovered something profound about the nature of human consciousness, but who lacks the wisdom to control what he has unleashed." The fog pressed closer to the windows, and Watson could imagine it seeping through the city like a living thing, touching every doorway and windowsill with its cool, damp fingers. The symptoms Poole described, they sound almost like a form of madness, yes, Holmes said gently, but not the kind that comes from a broken mind. Rather the kind that might come from a mind that has become too open, too receptive to experiences that ordinary consciousness filters out. Watson considered this, feeling the smooth texture of his chair's armrest beneath his palm, the way the dying firelight played across the familiar objects of their sitting room. "You think his formula has removed some kind of protective barrier?" "I think," Holmes said slowly, "that Henry Jekyll has succeeded in doing what he set out to do. He has separated the different aspects of human consciousness, but in doing so, he may have created something that cannot be easily reunited." The clock on the mantel chimed 11 times, each note clear and pure in the quiet air. Watson could feel fatigue settling over him like a comfortable blanket, but his mind remained alert, turning over the possibilities presented by Poole's story. "The incidents he described," Watson said thoughtfully, "don't sound violent or malicious. Disturbing certainly, but more confused than dangerous." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "Which suggests that whatever Henry has become, he retains some core of his original nature. The question is whether that core is strong enough to serve as an anchor, something we can use to guide him back to stability." Outside, the fog had thickened, turning the gaslight into soft, diffused glows that seemed to float like spirits in the darkness. Watson could hear the distant sound of the Thames, its eternal flow a reminder that even in the midst of mystery and uncertainty, some things remained constant and reliable. "Tomorrow," Holmes said softly, rising from his chair with fluid grace, "we'll visit Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. We'll examine his notes, his equipment, try to understand exactly what he was attempting to achieve." Watson nodded, feeling the pull of sleep beginning to tug at the edges of his consciousness. "And if we find him—" Holmes paused at the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. "Then we'll try to help him remember who he was before he discovered who he could become." The words hung in the air like incense, carrying with them both hope and uncertainty. Watson remained in his chair for a few more minutes after Holmes had retired, listening to the gentle sounds of the house settling for the night, feeling the warmth of the dying fire against his face. Outside, London slept under its blanket of fog, and somewhere in its winding streets a brilliant man wandered between the various selves he had unlocked, searching perhaps for a way back to the simple unity of ordinary existence. The thought filled Watson with a profound sadness. the kind that comes from contemplating the price of knowledge when it is pursued without wisdom. Finally he rose and made his way to his own room, leaving the dying fire to cast its last gentle shadows across the empty chairs where so many mysteries had been discussed, so many human puzzles contemplated with patience and compassion. The morning came softly to London, the fog lifting gradually like a curtain being slowly raised on a familiar stage. Watson woke to the sound of Mrs. Hudson moving about downstairs, her footsteps a comforting rhythm that spoke of normal days and ordinary concerns. The smell of breakfast drifted up through the house, bacon and eggs, fresh bread, the rich aroma of strong tea that would help clear the mind for the day's work ahead. Holmes was already dressed when Watson emerged from his room, standing at the window with a cup of tea in his hands, watching the street below as it emerged from the night's shroud of mist. His movements were calm and deliberate, and Watson could see that his friend had already begun the mental preparation that preceded their more challenging cases. "Sleep well?" Holmes asked, without turning from the window, his voice carrying the gentle warmth of morning conversation. "Well enough," Watson replied, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Hudson with grateful hands. The porcelain was warm against his palms, and the bergamot scent that rose with the steam helped to dispel the last traces of sleep from his mind. "And you?" "I spent some time thinking about Dr. Jekyll's situation," Holmes said, finally turning from the window. "The more I consider it, the more convinced I become that his condition is not madness in any conventional sense, but rather a kind of overabundance of consciousness." Watson settled into his chair with his breakfast, savouring the simple pleasure of warm food on a cool morning. "Meaning?" "Consider what we know of human perception," Holmes said, settling into his own chair with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "We see, hear, feel, taste and smell only a tiny fraction of what actually exists around us. Our minds filter out most sensory information, because otherwise we would be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of experience." The morning light filtered through the fog outside, casting everything in a soft, pearl-like glow that made the familiar room seem somehow more peaceful, more contemplative. Watson could taste the salt in his eggs, feel the smooth butter on his bread, hear the gentle bubble of Mrs. Hudson's teapot in the kitchen below. "You think, Doctor, Jekyll's formula has disrupted those filters?" Watson asked. "I think," Holmes said carefully, cutting his toast with precise movements, "that Henry Jekyll may have discovered how to access aspects of consciousness that are normally suppressed or ignored. The personality changes, the apparent madness, these might be the mind's attempt to process experiences for which it has no proper framework." Watson considered this as he sipped his tea, feeling the warm liquid spread through his chest like liquid comfort. That would explain the erratic behaviour, the claims of seeing things others cannot see. "Exactly," Holmes said, his grey eyes brightening with the satisfaction of a theory beginning to take shape. "And if that's the case, then our approach to helping him must be very different from what one might use with ordinary madness." Outside, the city was beginning to stir to life. Watson could hear the clip-clop of delivery horses, the distant call of street vendors, the gradual increase in foot traffic that marked London's awakening from its foggy slumber. These sounds formed a comforting backdrop to their conversation, a reminder that while they contemplated extraordinary mysteries, ordinary life continued its eternal dance around them. After breakfast, they made their way through the gradually clearing streets toward Dr. Jekyll's residence in a quiet square not far from the university. The fog still clung to the lower areas, pooling in doorways and swirling around the bases of lampposts like ghostly memories of the night before. Watson could smell the mixture of coal smoke and damp earth that was London's characteristic morning scent, could feel the cool moisture in the air against his face. Dr. Poole met them at the front door, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night, but his manner still composed and professional. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "I've prepared the laboratory as you requested. Nothing has been disturbed since Henry's disappearance. The house itself was elegantly appointed, but seemed somehow hollow, as if the absence of its owner had drained it of vitality." Their footsteps echoed softly on the polished wooden floors as Poole led them through corridors lined with books and scientific instruments, past windows that filtered the morning light into gentle contemplative patterns. Henry was always fascinated by the boundary between science and philosophy, Paul explained as they walked, his voice carrying the reverent tone of someone discussing a departed friend. He believed that chemistry could unlock not just the secrets of matter, but the mysteries of consciousness itself. The laboratory, when they reached it, was a testament to both brilliant organisation and chaotic experimentation. Glass apparatus covered every available surface, their curves and angles catching the light from tall windows and throwing prismatic rainbows across the walls. The air still carried the faint scent of chemicals, not harsh or unpleasant, but complex and layered, like a perfume composed of knowledge and discovery. Holmes moved through the space with careful deliberation, his trained eye taking in every detail. Watson could see him cataloguing not just what was present, but what was absent, what had been disturbed, what patterns of work and thought the arrangement of the equipment might reveal. "Here," Paul said, leading them to a corner where a large desk sat covered with papers and notebooks. "These are Henry's most recent notes. The formula he mentioned in his letter should be described somewhere among them." Watson approached the desk with the reverence due to another man's thoughts made visible. The handwriting was elegant but showed signs of increasing urgency as the entries progressed, letters growing larger, words occasionally repeated, margins filled with sudden insights and corrections. "Listen to this," Holmes said softly, reading from one of the notebooks. "July 15th. The separation is becoming more complete. Hyde exists now not merely as an aspect of my personality, but as a distinct consciousness with his own memories and preferences. When I transform, I retain awareness of being Jekyll, but from a distance, as if observing someone else's life through a window." The words carried a weight that seemed to press against the morning light, and Watson found himself thinking of how strange it must be to watch oneself from the outside, to experience the dissolution of the boundaries that normally define identity. "August 3rd, Holmes continued. "The formula requires adjustment. Hyde grows stronger with each transformation, more independent. I begin to fear that the separation may become permanent. Must find a way to reintegrate the divided aspects before the connection is lost entirely." Watson moved to another section of the desk, where chemical formulas were written in increasingly frantic handwriting. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of equations that seemed to spiral across the page like thoughts chasing their own tails. The complexity is extraordinary. He wasn't just separating personality traits, he was attempting to isolate specific neurochemical processes. Holmes joined him, their heads bent over the papers in shared concentration. The laboratory around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to unlock the secrets hidden in its former master's work. September 20th, Holmes read from another entry. Breakthrough achieved. New synthesis allows not merely separation but amplification. Each aspect of personality can be experienced in its pure form, undiluted by the compromises of integrated consciousness. The implications are staggering. But here the entries became more erratic, the handwriting shifting between Jekyll's careful script and something altogether wilder, more impulsive. Watson could see where different hands had written in the same notebook, as if multiple personalities had shared the same space but not the same perspective. October 1st, Watson read, struggling with handwriting that seemed to dance across the page. "I am become a prism through which the white light of consciousness is broken into its component colours. Each transformation reveals new spectrums of experience, new ways of perceiving reality that ordinary consciousness cannot access." The entries after this became increasingly difficult to decipher, filled with diagrams that looked more like mystical symbols than scientific notation, observations that read more like poetry than research notes. Watson could feel a growing unease as he realised how far Dr. Jekyll had travelled from conventional scientific method into territories where empirical observation blended with visionary experience. "Holmes," he said quietly, "look at this final entry." Holmes moved to Watson's side, and together they read the last coherent passage in the notebook. "November 15th. The formula is complete. I have found the key that unlocks not just the divided self, but the multiplied self. Consciousness is not binary, not simply Jekyll and Hyde, but infinite. Each drop of the new compound reveals another facet of human potential, another way of experiencing existence. I am no longer one man pretending to be whole, but many men learning to coexist in a single form. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of understanding. Outside they could hear the gentle sounds of morning, horses passing in the street, the distant call of a chimney sweep, the soft murmur of servants going about their daily tasks. These ordinary sounds seemed somehow more precious now, more valuable for their simple, uncomplicated nature. "He succeeded," Holmes said finally, his voice soft with a mixture of admiration and concern. He actually found a way to access multiple states of consciousness simultaneously. Watson ran his fingers along the edge of the notebook, feeling the texture of paper that had captured such extraordinary thoughts. "But the cost," Poole said from behind them, his voice heavy with sadness, "is that he no longer knows which consciousness is truly his. When I received his letter, I could see traces of at least 3 different handwriting styles in the same paragraph. Henry Jekyll has become a democracy of selves, and there's no clear way to determine which one should be in charge." Holmes moved away from the desk, his attention drawn to the chemical apparatus that covered the laboratory tables. The glassware caught the morning light beautifully, creating patterns of illumination that danced across the walls like captured sunlight. Watson could smell the lingering traces of various compounds, some familiar from his medical training, others completely unknown. "This equipment," Holmes said, his fingers hovering just above a complex distillation apparatus. "It's been used recently, within the last few days, I'd say." Watson joined him, noting the slight residue in several beakers, the arrangement of instruments that suggested recent use rather than long abandonment. "He's been back here? Or one of his selves has," Poole said grimly. "The servants report seeing lights in the laboratory at odd hours, hearing movement when the house should be empty. But when they investigate, they find nothing." Holmes lifted a small vial that contained perhaps an ounce of clear liquid, holding it up to the light from the tall windows. The substance seemed ordinary enough, colourless, odourless, with the consistency of water, but Watson could sense the potential contained within those few drops. "The new formula," Holmes said, not quite a question. "I believe so," Poole confirmed. "Henry's final synthesis, the compound that allows him to access multiple personalities simultaneously rather than transforming from one to another." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, and if he's been taking regular doses, then his condition is likely deteriorating rapidly, Holmes said, setting the vial down with extreme care. "The human mind isn't designed to host multiple competing consciousnesses. Eventually, the strain would become unbearable." They spent the next hour examining the laboratory more thoroughly, noting the careful organisation that spoke of Jekyll's methodical nature, as well as the signs of recent disturbance that suggested someone, or several someones, had been working there with a less systematic approach. Watson found himself thinking about the profound loneliness that must accompany such an existence, to be simultaneously multiple people and yet fundamentally isolated from human connection. It was as they were preparing to leave that Holmes made the discovery that would shape their next steps. Hidden beneath a stack of apparently routine correspondence, he found a recent letter written in Jekyll's hand, but a version of his handwriting they hadn't seen before, more controlled than the frantic scrawls of his final experiments, yet somehow more detached than his earlier, warmer correspondence. "Gentlemen," Holmes read aloud, his voice carrying the measured cadence of careful revelation. "If you are reading this, then Dr. Poole has succeeded in enlisting your aid, and you have discovered my laboratory in its current state. I write this during a moment of unusual clarity, when the various aspects of my consciousness seem to be in temporary agreement about the course of action that must be taken." Watson moved closer, drawn by the strange formality of the language, the way it seemed to speak from a distance even while addressing them directly. Outside, the fog had lifted further, and shafts of golden sunlight were beginning to penetrate the laboratory windows, casting everything in a warm, contemplative glow. "I have become," the letter continued, "something that science has no proper terminology to describe. Not mad, though I understand why observers might reach that conclusion. Rather, I am expanded. My consciousness now encompasses multiple distinct perspectives, each valid, each real, each contributing to an understanding of existence that transcends ordinary human experience. Poole moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the awakening city. Watson could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had become slightly more rapid, as Holmes read words that seemed to come from his lost friend, and yet somehow not from him at all. The problem, Holmes continued reading, is not that I have lost my sanity, but that I have gained too much of it. Each personality I can now access possesses complete awareness, complete agency, complete conviction in the rightness of its particular perspective. Imagine, if you will, a committee where every member is absolutely certain they know the correct course of action, and no member is willing to yield to the others. Watson found himself thinking of the democratic metaphor Poole had used earlier, the idea of consciousness as a multiplicity rather than a unity. But this letter suggested something even more complex. Not just multiple selves, but multiple selves engaged in constant debate about the nature of reality itself. "I am writing to warn you," the letter went on, "that any attempt to cure me using conventional medical approaches will be not merely futile but potentially dangerous. My condition cannot be reversed by force or coercion, any more than you could force a symphony back into individual notes by hitting the musicians with hammers." Holmes paused in his reading, and Watson could see his friend's analytical mind working through the implications of Jekyll's words. The morning light had grown stronger, and the laboratory now felt less mysterious and more melancholy, like a place where great discoveries had been made at the cost of simple human happiness. "However," Holmes continued, "there may be a way to achieve integration without suppression. The key lies not in eliminating the multiple aspects of consciousness I have unlocked, but in helping them learn to coexist harmoniously. This will require patience, understanding, and above all the recognition that what I have become is not an aberration to be corrected, but an evolution to be guided." Watson felt a profound sadness settling over him like the fog that still lingered in the lower parts of the city. Here was a man who had pushed the boundaries of human knowledge so far that he had essentially left humanity behind, yet still hoped to find his way back to some form of connection with his fellow beings. "If you choose to help me," the letter concluded, "you will find me tonight at midnight in the garden behind St. Bartholomew's Church. I will be there not because I have arranged to meet you, but because the part of me that retains Henry Jekyll's memories and affections believes that place holds significance that transcends my current complications. Please understand that by the time you read this, I may no longer remember writing it, as my various selves do not always share their intentions with one another." The letter was signed with 3 different signatures: Henry Jekyll in the familiar script they knew, E. Hyde in aggressive angular letters, and a third signature that seemed to shift and flow even as they looked at it, as if the very letters were uncertain of their own identity. Holmes set the letter down carefully, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "A remarkable document," he said softly. "It suggests that despite his condition, some part of Dr. Jekyll retains both self-awareness and hope for resolution." Poole turned from the window, his face showing the strain of a man caught between hope and despair. "St. Bartholomew's Church. Henry and I used to walk in that garden when we were students. It was where he first explained his theories about the multiplicity of human nature, where he wondered aloud whether consciousness might be more like a spectrum than a single point of light." Watson checked his pocket watch, noting that they still had many hours before the appointed meeting. "That gives us time to prepare. But prepare for what exactly? How does one approach a man who exists as multiple people simultaneously?" Holmes moved through the laboratory one final time, his observant eyes taking in details that might prove important later. "Carefully," he said finally, "and with the understanding that we may be dealing not with one person in distress, but with several people who happen to share the same physical form." They left the laboratory with its secrets partially revealed, stepping back into the London morning that seemed almost aggressively normal after the strangeness of Jekyll's experimental world. The fog had lifted enough that they could see the familiar landmarks of the city, the spires of churches, the solid bulk of government buildings, the comfortable chaos of commercial streets where ordinary people went about their ordinary business. As they walked back toward Baker Street, Watson found himself acutely aware of his own singular consciousness, the way his thoughts and perceptions flowed in a single stream, unified and continuous. It struck him as miraculous that such simplicity could feel so complex, that one mind could contain enough complexity to spend a lifetime exploring without needing to fragment into multiple competing selves. "Holmes," he said as they paused at a street corner to let a carriage pass, "do you think there's really any hope of helping him?" Holmes was quiet for a moment, watching the flow of London life around them. Merchants calling their wares, children playing in doorways, gentlemen and ladies going about their daily business with the comfortable assumption that their own minds would remain reliably their own. "I think," Holmes said finally, "that Henry Jekyll has discovered something profound about the nature of consciousness. Whether that discovery proves to be a gift or a curse may depend largely on whether he can find a way to integrate his expanded awareness without losing the essential core of his humanity." They spent the afternoon in quiet preparation, though what exactly they were preparing for remained unclear. Holmes immersed himself in books about consciousness and identity, while Watson reviewed medical texts that might shed light on the neurological aspects of Jekyll's condition. The hours passed peacefully, marked by the gentle routine of afternoon tea and the comfortable silence of shared work. As evening approached, the fog began to gather again, creeping up from the Thames like a living thing returning to reclaim the city for the night. Watson could feel the change in the air, the way the light softened and the sounds of the street grew more muffled, more intimate. At 11:30, they made their way through the increasingly fog-shrouded streets towards St. Bartholomew's Church. The ancient building loomed out of the mist like something from a dream, its Gothic spires disappearing into the low-hanging clouds that had settled over London like a grey blanket. The garden behind the church was enclosed by high walls and filled with the kind of ancient trees that seemed to hold centuries of London's history in their gnarled branches. Fog pooled between the headstones and monuments, creating a landscape that felt removed from ordinary time and space, a place where extraordinary meetings might unfold according to their own strange logic. They positioned themselves near the garden gate, partially concealed by a large monument, but with a clear view of the central path where Jekyll might appear. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant toll of church bells marking the approach of midnight, and the soft drip of condensed fog falling from the tree branches like gentle rain. Watson could taste the moisture in the air, could feel the cool dampness against his face, could smell the mixture of earth and stone and growing things that gave the garden its timeless character. Beside him, Holmes stood with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to watching and waiting, his breathing barely visible in the cool air. Midnight came with the deep, resonant chiming of the church bells, the sound rolling across the fog-wrapped city like a summons to all the night's mysteries to reveal themselves. For several minutes after the bells fell silent, nothing moved in the garden except the gentle drift of mist between the monuments. Then, emerging from the fog as if he had been formed from it, a figure appeared on the central path. At first glance, it was unmistakably Dr. Henry Jekyll. The height, the bearing, the careful way he moved through the world that Watson remembered from Poole's descriptions. But as the figure drew closer, it became apparent that something had indeed changed about the man they had come to help. He moved with an odd rhythm, as if different parts of his body were responding to different internal commands. Sometimes his gait was the measured stride of a gentleman taking an evening constitutional, sometimes the hurried pace of a man late for an important appointment, sometimes the wandering meander of someone lost in thought. His hands moved as he walked, not in the purposeful gestures of ordinary conversation with oneself, but in what appeared to be responses to multiple simultaneous discussions. When he reached the centre of the garden, near a small fountain that had long since ceased to flow, he stopped and stood perfectly still. In the diffused light of the gas lamps that penetrated the fog, Watson could see that Jekyll's face showed the same kind of shifting quality as his movement. Sometimes the familiar features arranged in expressions of scholarly contemplation. Sometimes something altogether different, more primal and direct. "Henry," a voice said softly. Jekyll's own voice, but addressing someone who wasn't there. "Henry, they're here, just as you said they would be, though I'm not entirely certain why you thought it necessary to involve them in our situation." Holmes stepped forward carefully, moving with the deliberate calm of someone approaching a startled animal. "Doctor! Jekyll!" The figure turned toward them, and Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. Jekyll's eyes showed the same shifting quality as his expression, sometimes focused and intelligent, sometimes distant and contemplative, sometimes bright with an intensity that seemed almost feverish. "Ah," Jekyll said, his voice carrying multiple tones simultaneously, as if several people were speaking through the same mouth. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, how good of you to come, though I should mention that not all of us agreed this meeting was wise." "Which of you did agree?" Holmes asked gently, his question acknowledging the reality of Jekyll's condition without judgment or alarm. Jekyll's face shifted through several expressions before settling into something that resembled his original scholarly demeanour. "The part of me that still remembers friendship," he said, his voice growing softer, more recognisably human. "The part that believes connection with others is possible even in altered circumstances." Watson moved closer, his medical training helping him to observe Jekyll's condition with professional detachment while still feeling profound compassion for the man's evident struggle. "Dr. Jekyll, we're here to help. Dr. Poole is very concerned about your welfare." "Gabriel worries too much," Jekyll replied, but his voice carried affection beneath the words. "Though I suppose from his perspective my current state must appear quite problematic. Tell me, gentlemen, what exactly has he told you about my condition?" Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson before answering. "He's told us about your experiments with consciousness, about the transformation formula, about your evolution into multiple simultaneous selves." Jekyll's laugh was complex, containing notes of genuine amusement, bitter irony, and something that might have been relief. "Evolution. Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe it, though I sometimes think of it more as expansion. Imagine if you could experience life not just from your own perspective, but from several perspectives simultaneously. Imagine if you could see the world through the eyes of different aspects of human nature, the rational, the emotional, the intuitive, the primitive, all at once." The fog swirled around them as if responding to Jekyll's words, and Watson found himself thinking about the complexity of even ordinary consciousness, the way a single mind could contain multitudes of thoughts and feelings and impulses. What Jekyll described sounded less like madness than like an overwhelming abundance of awareness. "But the cost," Watson said gently, "must be enormous." Jekyll nodded slowly, his movements more coordinated now, as if the conversation was helping to focus his various selves around a common purpose. "The cost is coordination," he said. "When you have multiple valid perspectives on every situation, making decisions becomes challenging. Which self's desires should take priority? Which self's understanding of reality should guide action?" Holmes moved to a nearby bench, gesturing for Jekyll to join him. The simple normalcy of the invitation seemed to help stabilize Jekyll's condition somewhat, as if the familiar social ritual provided an anchor for his shifting consciousness. "Dr. Jekyll," Holmes said as they all settled into positions around the small bench, "your letter suggested that you believe integration might be possible. Can you tell us more about what that might involve?" Jekyll was quiet for a long moment, his breathing visible in the cool air as small puffs of vapour that caught the filtered gaslight. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful precision of a man trying to explain something that existed beyond ordinary language. "The various aspects of my consciousness," he said slowly. "They're not separate entities competing for control. They're more like instruments in an orchestra that has forgotten how to play together. Each instrument is perfect in its own right, but without a conductor, without harmony, they create only chaos." Watson felt a stirring of hope at these words, at the suggestion that Jekyll still possessed enough unified awareness to conceptualize his condition and perhaps work toward its resolution. And the conductor? Holmes asked. Would be some form of meta-consciousness, Jekyll replied, his voice growing more confident as he explored the idea. Some awareness that could encompass and coordinate the various aspects without suppressing them. Not the old, limited consciousness of Henry Jekyll alone, but something new, something more complete. The fog seemed to be thinning slightly, and Watson could make out more details of the garden around them, the ancient headstones with their worn inscriptions, the gnarled trees that had stood sentinel over so many human stories, the monuments to lives that had found their own forms of completion and rest. How might such integration be achieved? Holmes asked, his voice carrying the gentle persistence of someone helping another person think through a complex problem. Jekyll's expression shifted again, but this time the change seemed more purposeful, as if he were consciously drawing upon different aspects of his expanded consciousness to consider the question. The chemical approach has reached its limits, he said finally. Further pharmaceutical intervention would only increase the chaos. What's needed now is psychological architecture, a framework for organizing multiple perspectives into coherent action. Watson leaned forward, intrigued by the precision of Jekyll's analysis. You speak as if you've given this considerable thought. We have, Jekyll replied, and Watson noticed the natural way he used the plural pronoun. Each aspect of my consciousness has been working on the problem from its own perspective. The rational self seeks systematic solutions. The emotional self desires harmony. The intuitive self searches for underlying patterns. The primitive self simply wants survival. The challenge is finding an approach that satisfies all these legitimate concerns simultaneously. Holmes was quiet for a moment, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications of what Jekyll had described. Dr. Jekyll, what you're describing sounds less like a medical condition than like a form of accelerated psychological development. Jekyll's face lit up with something approaching delight. Exactly, he said, his voice carrying more energy and coherence than it had shown since they arrived. I haven't become mentally ill. I've become mentally complex. The question is whether human society has frameworks for dealing with such complexity, or whether such consciousness is doomed to exist in isolation. The question hung in the fog-filled air like incense, carrying with it implications that extended far beyond Jekyll's individual situation. Watson found himself thinking about the nature of normalcy, about the comfortable limitations that ordinary consciousness imposed, and about whether those limitations might sometimes be protective rather than merely restrictive. The incidents Dr. Poole described, Watson said carefully, the erratic behaviour, the apparent confusion, are the result of different aspects of consciousness attempting to interact with a world designed for singular awareness, Jekyll explained, his voice patient but tinged with sadness. When the rational self tries to have a conversation while the emotional self is processing overwhelming sensory input, and the primitive self is responding to perceived threats, the result can appear quite disturbed to outside observers. Holmes nodded slowly, his understanding evident in the way his posture had relaxed, his approach to Jekyll becoming less cautious and more collaborative. So the goal would be to develop some form of internal coordination system? Precisely, Jekyll said, his voice growing stronger and more unified with each exchange. The various aspects of consciousness need to learn to communicate with each other, to coordinate their responses, to function as a team rather than as competing individuals. Watson felt a growing sense of optimism as he watched Jekyll's condition stabilise during their conversation. The man was clearly brilliant, clearly self-aware and clearly motivated to find a solution to his unusual situation. Dr. Jekyll, he said gently, would you be willing to work with us to develop such coordination, not as a patient to be cured, but as a collaborator in exploring new forms of human consciousness? Jekyll's response was immediate and profound. His entire posture shifted. His face took on an expression of relief so deep it was almost painful to witness, and his breathing became more regular and natural. Gentlemen, he said, his voice now carrying the warmth and humanity Watson remembered from Poole's descriptions, I cannot express how much it means to have my condition understood rather than pathologized. Yes, I would be honored to work with you. though I should warn you that the process may require considerable patience, as my various selves don't always agree on the best approach to anything, really." Holmes smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his usually serious features. "Dr. Jekyll, in our experience, the most interesting problems are also the most challenging ones. We would consider it a privilege to help you explore the territory you've discovered." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the fog swirling gently around them as if blessing their agreement. Watson could hear the distant sounds of London settling into sleep, the occasional clip-clop of late hooves on cobblestones, the distant toll of church bells marking the late hour, the whisper of wind through the ancient trees. "Where do we begin?" Jekyll asked finally, his voice carrying both hope and uncertainty. "With understanding," Holmes replied. "We need to map the territory of your expanded consciousness, to understand how the various aspects relate to each other, to identify patterns that might serve as the foundation for coordination." Watson nodded agreement. "And we need to do it gradually, carefully, with respect for the complexity you've achieved, rather than simply trying to force you back into conventional patterns." Jekyll's gratitude was visible in every line of his face, in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the steadier rhythm of his breathing. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "this strange journey I've undertaken might lead somewhere worth going after all." As they rose to leave the garden, Watson felt a profound sense of privilege at being invited into such an extraordinary human experience. Here was consciousness itself being reinvented, explored, expanded in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of identity and awareness. The fog seemed to part before them as they made their way back through the London streets, as if the city itself was welcoming their small procession back into the ordinary world where extraordinary things might nonetheless be possible with patience, understanding, and collaborative effort. Behind them, the garden settled back into its timeless silence, having witnessed another chapter in the endless human story of discovery, connection, and the search for meaning in experiences that transcend the boundaries of conventional understanding. In the days that followed, they began the careful work of mapping Jekyll's internal landscape. It was delicate work, requiring patience and creativity, as they developed methods for helping Jekyll's various aspects of consciousness communicate with each other more effectively. Holmes brought his skills in observation and analysis, watching for patterns in Jekyll's behaviour that might reveal underlying structures in his expanded awareness. Watson contributed his medical knowledge and his natural empathy, helping to create an environment where Jekyll felt safe to explore the full range of his condition without fear of judgment. They met in Holmes's sitting room each afternoon, the familiar environment providing stability as they ventured into psychological territories that had never been explored by conventional science. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, tea was served at regular intervals, and the comfortable routine helped to anchor their experimental sessions in the reassuring patterns of ordinary life. Jekyll proved to be a remarkable collaborator. His various aspects of consciousness, once they learned to coordinate their efforts, brought different but complementary perspectives to the work. His rational self provided systematic analysis, his emotional self contributed intuitive insights, his creative self suggested innovative approaches, and his primitive self kept them grounded in practical concerns about survival and well-being. Gradually they developed what Jekyll came to call his internal parliament, a psychological framework that allowed his various selves to deliberate together rather than competing for control. It wasn't a return to his original singular consciousness, but rather an evolution towards something more complex and potentially more complete. The process was not without challenges. There were afternoons when Jekyll's coordination would collapse completely, leaving him unable to focus on anything for more than a few seconds at a time. There were sessions when different aspects of his consciousness would argue so intensely that meaningful conversation became impossible. There were moments when the weight of his expanded awareness seemed to overwhelm him entirely, leaving him exhausted and discouraged. But there were also breakthrough moments, times when Jekyll would achieve a level of integration that allowed him to function with remarkable clarity and insight. During these periods, his conversation became extraordinarily rich, drawing upon multiple perspectives simultaneously to offer observations about human nature that neither Holmes nor Watson had ever encountered. "I can see," Jekyll said during one particularly successful session, "how limiting ordinary consciousness really is. Not wrong, not inferior, but narrow. Like seeing the world through a single window when you could be experiencing it from an entire house full of windows, each offering a different view of the same magnificent landscape." Watson found these sessions profoundly educational, not just about Jekyll's unique condition, but about the nature of consciousness itself. He began to notice aspects of his own awareness that he had previously taken for granted, the way different moods could reveal different facets of the same situation, the way creative insights seemed to emerge from sources beyond rational analysis, the way emotional responses often contained information that purely logical thinking missed. Holmes, characteristically, became fascinated by the investigative potential of Jekyll's expanded consciousness. "Imagine," he said one evening after Jekyll had departed, "approaching a mystery with multiple simultaneous perspectives, being able to consider rational deduction, emotional intuition, creative hypothesis, and primitive instinct all at the same time." "It would certainly change the nature of detective work," Watson agreed, though he couldn't help but think about the personal cost such expansion might entail. "Though I wonder whether the human spirit is designed to bear such complexity without losing something essential in the process." As autumn deepened into winter, Jekyll's progress became more consistent. His internal parliament learned to function more smoothly, with each aspect of consciousness contributing its perspective without drowning out the others. He developed techniques for shifting focus between different selves when particular situations required specific approaches, while maintaining overall coordination through what he called his observing self, a meta-consciousness that could watch and guide the interactions between his various aspects. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Jekyll remained fundamentally changed from the man he'd been before his experiments, but he had evolved from chaotic multiplicity toward coordinated complexity. He was no longer lost in the maze of his expanded consciousness, but had learned to navigate it with growing skill and confidence. Dr. Poole, when he witnessed one of Jekyll's more successful integration sessions, wept openly with relief and joy. "Henry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you haven't just survived your transformation, you've mastered it. You've become something entirely new while still remaining recognizably yourself." Jekyll's response was characteristic of his evolved state, complex, thoughtful, and drawing upon multiple perspectives simultaneously. "I've learned," he said gently, "that consciousness isn't a fixed thing to be preserved unchanged, but a dynamic process to be explored and developed. What I am now isn't what I was before, but it includes what I was before, plus much more." As winter gave way to spring, Jekyll began to consider how his evolved consciousness might be applied to broader human concerns. His expanded awareness, once stabilized through his internal parliament, proved capable of insights that conventional thinking struggled to achieve. He began working with physicians to understand emotional disorders from the inside, offering perspectives on mental distress that came from his experience of multiple simultaneous states of consciousness. He collaborated with philosophers to explore questions about the nature of identity and selfhood that his condition had made personal and immediate. He even worked with artists and writers, helping them to access creative states that might otherwise remain beyond reach. "I've become," he told Holmes and Watson during one of their regular sessions, "a kind of translator between different modes of human consciousness. I can experience the world from multiple perspectives and then find ways to communicate those experiences to people who live within singular awareness." Watson found this development profoundly moving. Jekyll had transformed a condition that could have been seen as a form of madness into a unique capacity for service to others. He had learned not just to manage his expanded consciousness, but to use it as a gift for understanding and helping his fellow human beings. Holmes, ever the analyst, was intrigued by the broader implications of Jekyll's evolution. "You've essentially developed a new form of human consciousness," he observed. "The question is whether such development is sustainable, and whether it might be safely accessible to others." Jekyll's response revealed the wisdom he had gained through his extraordinary journey. "I think," he said carefully, that consciousness expansion of this magnitude requires not just chemical intervention, but psychological preparation, social support, and above all, a deep commitment to using expanded awareness in service of connection rather than separation. He paused, his gaze moving between his two friends with gratitude and affection clearly visible. Without your willingness to understand rather than pathologize, without your patience in helping me develop coordination among my various selves, I would certainly have been lost in the chaos of my own complexity. Expanded consciousness, it seems, is not a solitary achievement, but a collaborative one. As spring deepened toward summer, Jekyll's integration became so complete that casual observers might not have noticed anything unusual about him at all. He had learned to access his various aspects of consciousness fluidly, drawing upon rational analysis when solving problems, emotional intuition when dealing with interpersonal situations, creative insight when approaching novel challenges, and primitive wisdom when facing situations requiring immediate survival responses. But those who knew him well could see the difference. There was a depth to his awareness, a richness to his responses, a capacity for simultaneous multiple perspectives that marked him as someone who had travelled far beyond the boundaries of ordinary human consciousness and successfully returned with gifts for the rest of humanity. The collaboration between Jekyll, Holmes, and Watson continued, evolving from crisis intervention into ongoing exploration of the frontiers of human consciousness. Their work together became a model for approaching psychological complexity with curiosity rather than alarm, with collaboration rather than coercion, with respect for human potential rather than insistence on conformity to narrow definitions of normalcy. And in the quiet of London evenings, when the fog rolled in from the Thames and the gas lamps cast their gentle glow through the mist, three friends would sit by the fire in Baker Street, sharing tea and conversation, exploring the mysteries of consciousness with the same patient attention they had once brought to the puzzles of crime and detection. Jekyll's laboratory, once a place of chaotic experimentation, became a centre for careful research into the nature of human awareness. Under his guidance and with the collaborative support of Holmes and Watson, it evolved into something like a workshop for consciousness, a place where the boundaries of human potential could be explored safely, gradually, and always in service of greater understanding and connection. The fog that had once seemed to symbolize confusion and isolation became, in their shared experience, a metaphor for the gentle mystery that surrounds all human consciousness, not something to be feared or dispelled, but something to be appreciated for the way it makes familiar landscapes new and strange and full of undiscovered possibilities. And in that fog-wrapped city, where gaslight and shadow dance together in eternal partnership, the story of Jekyll's transformation from chaos to coordination became part of London's vast collection of human stories, tales of discovery and loss, of expansion and integration, of the endless human journey toward greater understanding of the magnificent complexity that lies within every human consciousness, waiting patiently to be explored with wisdom, patience, and love. In the end, Jekyll's journey taught them all that consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Not a fixed structure to be preserved, but a dynamic process to be explored. Not a solitary achievement, but a collaborative adventure that requires the support and understanding of those who love us enough to accompany us into territories where no maps exist, and only compassion can serve as a reliable guide. The story concluded, as all the best stories do, not with final answers but with deeper questions, not with simple resolution but with expanded possibility, not with the end of mystery but with the beginning of greater appreciation for the profound complexity and beauty that lives within every human soul, waiting patiently for the courage and wisdom to be expressed in all its magnificent multiplicity. And as the seasons turned and London life continued its eternal dance between tradition and change, the three friends continued their exploration of consciousness, each bringing their own gifts to the collaborative work of understanding what it means to be human in a world where the boundaries of possibility are limited only by our willingness to approach mystery with open hearts and patient minds. The fog still rolled in from the Thames each evening, still wrapped the city in its gentle embrace, still made the familiar world new and strange and full of wonder. But now it seemed less like an obstacle to clear vision than like a reminder of the beautiful mystery that surrounds all human experience, the mystery of consciousness itself, vast and patient and eternally generous with its gifts for those who approach it with respect, curiosity, and love. The weeks that followed Jekyll's initial integration were filled with the careful, patient work of deepening his coordination between different aspects of consciousness. Each morning brought new challenges and new discoveries, as his internal parliament learned to function more smoothly, and his expanded awareness began to stabilise into something approaching sustainable equilibrium. Watson found himself keeping detailed notes of their sessions, fascinated by the way Jekyll's conditions seemed to illuminate aspects of ordinary consciousness that most people never noticed. The careful attention required to help Jekyll coordinate his multiple selves had taught Watson to observe the subtle shifts in his own awareness, the way different moods could reveal different aspects of the same situation, the way fatigue could alter perception, the way emotional states could influence rational thinking in ways both helpful and problematic. "I'm beginning to understand," Watson confided to Holmes one evening as they sat by the fire after a particularly productive session with Jekyll, "that what we call normal consciousness is actually quite complex itself. We just happen to experience it as unified because we've never learned to notice the different aspects that comprise it." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his pipe sending lazy spirals of smoke toward the ceiling, where they caught the firelight and danced like visible thoughts. "Jekyll's condition has certainly illuminated the artificial nature of the boundaries we normally draw around identity and selfhood," he agreed. "The question that intrigues me is whether his expanded awareness might represent an evolution of human consciousness, or simply an interesting aberration." Outside their window, London continued its eternal dance of fog and gaslight, the sounds of evening settling over the city like a familiar blanket. Horse hooves on cobblestones provided a steady rhythm, punctuated occasionally by the distant call of a night watchman or the soft splash of water against the Thames embankment. These ordinary sounds had taken on a deeper significance during their work with Jekyll, serving as anchors to the conventional world while they explored territories of consciousness that conventional science had barely begun to acknowledge. Jekyll himself was experiencing profound changes as his integration deepened. The chaotic shifting between personalities that had characterized his early condition was being replaced by something more like a fluid ability to access different modes of awareness as situations required. He could shift from rational analysis to emotional intuition to creative insight with increasing smoothness, while maintaining an overall sense of continuity and purpose that held all his various aspects together. "Is rather like learning to play multiple instruments simultaneously," Jekyll explained during one of their sessions, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone trying to describe experiences that existed beyond ordinary language. "At first, the sounds clash terribly and create nothing but noise. But gradually, with patience and practice, they begin to harmonize, each contributing its own voice to a more complex and beautiful symphony." The metaphor resonated deeply with both Holmes and Watson, who could see the truth of it reflected in Jekyll's increasingly coordinated behaviour. Where once his different aspects of consciousness had seemed to be fighting for control, now they appeared to be collaborating, each contributing its particular gifts to whatever situation Jekyll was facing. This evolution was particularly evident in Jekyll's interactions with other people. His expanded awareness allowed him to perceive emotional subtleties that most people missed entirely, to understand the unspoken needs and concerns that lay beneath surface conversations, to respond with a depth of empathy and insight that seemed almost supernatural to those who didn't understand the source of his abilities. Dr. Poole, who visited regularly to observe Jekyll's progress, was amazed by the transformation. "Henry," he said during one particularly successful visit, "you've not only survived your journey into expanded consciousness, you've learned to use it as a gift for understanding and helping others. You've become more fully human than you were before your experiments began." Jekyll's response revealed the wisdom he had gained through his extraordinary ordeal. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that consciousness is like a vast library that most of us only ever explore a few rooms of. My experiments forced me to wander into sections I wasn't prepared for, without a map or a guide. The chaos that resulted nearly destroyed me. But with your help," he looked gratefully at Holmes and Watson, "I've learned not just to navigate the library, but to serve as a guide for others who might want to explore rooms they've never visited." This metaphor proved prophetic, as Jekyll gradually began working with other individuals who were struggling with various forms of psychological complexity. His ability to understand multiple perspectives simultaneously, combined with his hard-won wisdom about coordinating different aspects of consciousness, made him uniquely qualified to help others who felt torn between conflicting aspects of their own personalities. Watson observed these consultations with growing fascination, noting how Jekyll's approach differed fundamentally from conventional medical practice. Rather than attempting to suppress or eliminate problematic aspects of personality, Jekyll worked to help people understand and integrate their various psychological components, creating internal harmony rather than simply managing symptoms. "What you're doing," Watson told Jekyll after observing a particularly successful session with a young woman who had been struggling with severe mood fluctuations, "it's not just therapy, it's a completely new approach to understanding mental health. You're treating psychological complexity as a resource to be developed rather than a problem to be solved." Jekyll's face lit up with the kind of satisfaction that comes from being deeply understood. "Exactly," he said, his voice carrying warmth and enthusiasm. "Most approaches to mental distress assume that health equals simplicity, that the goal should be to reduce complexity rather than to organize it. But what if complexity itself isn't the problem? What if the problem is simply lack of coordination, lack of internal communication?" Holmes, who had been listening to this exchange with his characteristic intensity, leaned forward in his chair. "You're suggesting that what we call mental illness might often be a form of internal conflict rather than actual pathology." "In many cases, yes," Jekyll replied, his response drawing upon both his scientific training and his lived experience of consciousness fragmentation and reintegration. When different aspects of personality are working at cross purposes, when they're not communicating effectively, when one aspect dominates to the exclusion of others, the result can certainly appear pathological, but the underlying problem may be organisational rather than medical. This insight proved to have far-reaching implications as Jekyll's work attracted attention from other physicians and researchers interested in understanding the nature of consciousness and mental health. His laboratory became a gathering place for discussions that challenged conventional assumptions about normalcy, sanity, and the boundaries of human psychological potential. Dr. Sarah Pemberton, a pioneering researcher in the emerging field of psychology, became one of Jekyll's most frequent collaborators. Her own work with patients suffering from what was then called hysteria had led her to suspect that many psychological symptoms reflected struggles to integrate conflicting aspects of personality rather than simple medical conditions. "Your experience," she told Jekyll during one of their extended discussions, "provides a kind of roadmap for understanding how consciousness might be organised. If we can help people develop the kind of internal coordination you've achieved, we might be able to address psychological distress at its source rather than simply managing its symptoms." Jekyll nodded enthusiastically, his various aspects of consciousness clearly aligned around this vision of applied psychological research. "The key," he said, "is approaching complexity with curiosity rather than alarm, with integration rather than suppression as the goal. Most people have much more psychological richness than they realise. They simply lack the frameworks for organising and expressing it constructively." As autumn deepened and the fog began to roll in earlier each evening, Jekyll's work expanded beyond individual consultations to include group sessions, where people with various forms of psychological complexity could learn from each other's experiences. These gatherings, held in Jekyll's laboratory surrounded by the apparatus of his original experiments, created an atmosphere where unusual experiences could be shared without judgment or pathologizing. Watson attended several of these sessions and was struck by the quality of understanding and support that developed among the participants. People who had felt isolated by their psychological differences discovered that their experiences, while unique in detail, shared common themes with others who had struggled to integrate conflicting aspects of personality. "What's happening here?" Watson observed to Holmes after one particularly moving session. "It's like a community of people who have all travelled to the same foreign country but by different routes. They're able to help each other navigate territories that conventional society doesn't even acknowledge exist." Holmes, who had been observing the sessions with his characteristic analytical attention, nodded slowly. "Jekyll has essentially created a laboratory for consciousness development," he said. "A place where the boundaries of human psychological potential can be explored safely, gradually, and always in service of greater integration, rather than mere sensation-seeking." This distinction proved crucial as news of Jekyll's work began to attract attention from less scrupulous individuals interested in consciousness, altering substances for their own sake rather than as tools for genuine psychological development. Jekyll was careful to screen potential participants, ensuring that his laboratory remained focused on healing and integration rather than becoming a venue for recreational experimentation. "The work we're doing here," Jekyll explained to a group of physicians who had come to observe his methods, "requires not just chemical knowledge but psychological wisdom, emotional maturity, and above all a commitment to using expanded awareness in service of greater connection with others rather than escape from ordinary reality." His emphasis on service and connection reflected the hard-won wisdom of his own journey from chaos to coordination. Jekyll had learned through direct experience that consciousness expansion, without ethical grounding and social support, could easily become a form of sophisticated isolation, cutting the individual off from meaningful human relationships rather than deepening them. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of thick fog that seemed to muffle the entire city in grey velvet. The gas lamps created halos of warm light that barely penetrated the mist, and the sounds of London life became muffled and mysterious, as if the city itself was speaking in whispers. It was during this foggy season that Jekyll made his most significant breakthrough in understanding the nature of his expanded consciousness. Working late one evening in his laboratory, surrounded by the gentle hiss of gas flames and the soft bubbling of chemical apparatus, he experienced what he later described as a moment of complete integration, a state in which all his various aspects of consciousness were not just coordinated, but genuinely unified around a single clear purpose. It was, he told Holmes and Watson the next day, his voice carrying the wonder of someone describing a transformative experience, as if all the different instruments in my internal orchestra suddenly remembered they were playing the same piece of music. Not just playing together, but playing the same song, each contributing its unique voice to a harmony that was greater than any of the individual parts. Watson leaned forward, intrigued by the precision of Jekyll's description. "How long did this state last?" "Several hours," Jekyll replied, his face reflecting the memory of profound peace and clarity. "During that time, I experienced a level of awareness that encompassed all my various perspectives simultaneously, while maintaining perfect internal coordination. I could access rational analysis, emotional wisdom, creative insight, and primitive intuition all at once, without any sense of conflict or confusion." Holmes, ever the analyst, was fascinated by the implications. "And afterward?" "Afterward I returned to my usual state of coordinated multiplicity," Jekyll said, though his voice carried no disappointment. "But the experience taught me something crucial about the direction my development might take. Complete integration isn't just possible, it's the natural evolution of expanded consciousness when it's allowed to develop gradually and supported by genuine human connection. This breakthrough led to intensive exploration of the conditions that had made such complete integration possible." Jekyll, working with Holmes and Watson, began to identify the psychological and environmental factors that seemed to facilitate the kind of deep coordination he had experienced. The key elements, Jekyll concluded after several weeks of careful analysis, appear to be safety, purpose, and connection. When I feel genuinely safe to explore my full range of consciousness, when I have a clear sense of purpose that all my aspects can align around, and when I'm connected to others who understand and support my journey, integration happens naturally. This insight proved revolutionary for Jekyll's work with others struggling with psychological complexity. By creating environments that embodied these principles, safety, purpose, and connection, he was able to help people achieve levels of internal coordination that conventional approaches had never approached. Dr. Pemberton, who had been documenting Jekyll's methods with scientific rigour, published the first academic paper describing his approach to consciousness integration. The paper, titled Toward a Psychology of Internal Coordination, introduced Jekyll's work to the broader scientific community and sparked intense debate about the nature of consciousness and the goals of psychological intervention. What Dr. Jekyll has achieved, Pemberton wrote, challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of mental health and human potential. His experience suggests that consciousness is far more malleable and expandable than we have previously imagined, and that what we call psychological problems may often be opportunities for development rather than conditions requiring cure. The publication of this paper brought Jekyll's work to international attention, attracting visitors from across Europe and America who came to observe his methods and learn from his experience. Jekyll welcomed these visitors with characteristic generosity, sharing his insights freely while maintaining careful boundaries around the practical application of consciousness-expanding techniques. Knowledge of this magnitude, Jekyll explained to a gathering of international researchers, carries profound responsibility. The techniques I've developed can certainly facilitate consciousness expansion, but without proper preparation, support, and ethical grounding, they can also lead to the kind of chaos I experienced during my early experiments. His emphasis on responsibility and preparation reflected Jekyll's deep understanding of the potential dangers inherent in consciousness expansion work. He had learned through painful experience that the human psyche required careful preparation before it could safely navigate expanded states of awareness, and that integration was as important as expansion in determining whether such experiences would prove beneficial or harmful. Spring arrived gradually that year, the fog lifting slowly to reveal a London city that seemed somehow renewed, as if the winter's contemplative mist had prepared the way for fresh growth and new possibilities. In Jekyll's laboratory, the work of consciousness exploration continued with increasing sophistication and success. Jekyll himself had evolved far beyond the chaotic multiplicity that had characterized his early condition. His internal parliament now functioned with remarkable smoothness, allowing him to access different modes of consciousness fluidly while maintaining overall coordination and purpose. He had become, in effect, a living demonstration of human psychological potential, developed to levels that conventional psychology had never imagined possible. But perhaps more importantly, Jekyll had learned to use his expanded awareness as a gift for understanding and serving others. His work with people struggling with psychological complexity had helped dozens of individuals achieve greater internal harmony and life satisfaction. His research had contributed to a growing understanding of consciousness as a dynamic, expandable capacity rather than a fixed structure. And his example had demonstrated that even the most chaotic psychological conditions could be transformed into resources for greater wisdom and compassion. Holmes and Watson continued their regular collaboration with Jekyll, finding that their own understanding of human nature had been profoundly deepened by their association with his extraordinary journey. Their detective work had been enriched by insights into the multiplicity of human motivation and the complexity of identity that Jekyll's experience had revealed. "I find myself approaching every case differently now," Holmes confided to Watson one evening as they sat by their familiar fire. "Jekyll's experience has taught me to look for the various aspects of personality that might be driving a person's behaviour, rather than assuming that people act from single, unified motives." Watson nodded, understanding exactly what Holmes meant. "And in my medical practice, I've begun to see symptoms as communications from different aspects of the person, rather than simply problems to be eliminated. It's led to much more effective treatment because I'm addressing the whole person rather than just presenting a complaint." Their ongoing friendship with Jekyll had also provided them with a unique window into the frontiers of human consciousness development. They had witnessed firsthand the transformation of chaos into coordination, of confusion into clarity, of isolation into connection. The experience had taught them that human potential was far more vast and malleable than they had ever suspected. As summer arrived with its long, warm evenings and gentle breezes that carried the scent of blooming flowers through the open windows of Jekyll's laboratory, the work there took on an increasingly celebratory quality. What had begun as crisis intervention had evolved into a thriving centre for consciousness research and development, a place where the boundaries of human psychological potential were being explored with scientific rigour and philosophical wisdom. Jekyll's personal integration continued to deepen, reaching levels of coordination and functionality that exceeded even his most optimistic early projections. He had not simply learned to manage his expanded consciousness. He had learned to inhabit it fully, to use all his various aspects as resources for greater understanding and more effective action in the world. "I sometimes think," Jekyll told Holmes and Watson during one of their regular evening conversations, "that my early experiments, chaotic as they were, may have been necessary preparation for what I've become. The confusion and fragmentation forced me to develop integration skills that I never would have needed if I had remained within the boundaries of ordinary consciousness." This perspective reflected Jekyll's characteristic ability to find meaning and purpose, even in his most difficult experiences. He had learned to see his journey not as a series of mistakes and corrections, but as a necessary exploration of territories that had previously been unmapped, an adventure in consciousness that had ultimately enriched not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who had been touched by his work. The laboratory itself had been transformed over the months of Jekyll's recovery and development. What had once been a place of solitary experimentation had become a gathering place for collaboration and mutual support. The chemical apparatus remained, but it was now surrounded by comfortable chairs where people could sit in circles for group discussions, bookshelves filled with works on psychology and philosophy, and bulletin boards where participants in Jekyll's programs could share insights and encouragement with each other. Dr. Poole, observing these changes during one of his regular visits, was moved to tears by the transformation. "Henry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've taken the most frightening experience imaginable, the dissolution of identity itself, and transformed it into a gift not just for yourself, but for everyone whose life you touch. You've become more than you were before, and you've helped others become more than they thought possible." Jekyll's response revealed the depth of wisdom he had gained through his extraordinary journey. "I think," he said gently, "that consciousness is like a vast ocean that most of us experience only from the shoreline. My experiments forced me to dive into deep waters without knowing how to swim, and I nearly drowned in the complexity I encountered there. But with your help, and the help of Holmes and Watson, I learned not just to swim, but to dive safely, and to guide others who want to explore depths they've never imagined." As autumn returned, bringing with it the familiar fog that had become such a significant part of their shared story, Jekyll's work reached a new level of maturity and sophistication. He had developed training programs for other professionals interested in consciousness work, published papers that were reshaping academic understanding of psychological potential, and established protocols for safe consciousness exploration that were being adopted by researchers around the world. But perhaps most importantly, Jekyll had learned to live fully within his expanded awareness, while maintaining deep, meaningful connections with others. He had discovered that consciousness development, rather than being a solitary pursuit, was actually a collaborative adventure that required the support and understanding of genuine community. The fog that evening was particularly thick, wrapping London in a gentle embrace that seemed to muffle the entire city in contemplative silence. As Holmes, Watson, and Jekyll sat by the fire in Baker Street, sharing tea and quiet conversation, they reflected on the journey that had brought them together and the work that continued to unfold. "I sometimes wonder," Watson mused, watching the firelight play across their faces, "what would have happened if we had approached Jekyll's condition as a medical problem to be solved rather than as a mystery to be explored?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. The conventional approach would certainly have been to attempt suppression or control rather than integration and development. Jekyll might have achieved stability, but at the cost of losing access to the expanded awareness that has become such a gift for others. Jekyll's response reflected the gratitude he felt for their willingness to approach his condition with curiosity rather than alarm, with collaboration rather than control. "What you gave me," he said softly, "was the most precious gift possible. The opportunity to become fully myself, not in spite of my complexity, but because of it. You helped me learn that consciousness expansion doesn't have to mean disconnection from humanity, but can actually lead to deeper connection than most people ever experience." Outside, the fog continued its gentle embrace of the sleeping city, and somewhere in its swirling depths, other stories were unfolding, stories of discovery and loss, of expansion and integration, of the endless human journey toward greater understanding of the magnificent complexity that dwells within every human consciousness. Their own story had become part of London's vast collection of human tales, a reminder that the boundaries of possibility are limited only by our willingness to approach mystery with patience, wisdom, and love. In a world where the conventional often masquerades as the complete, Jekyll's journey had demonstrated that human potential extends far beyond ordinary imagination, waiting patiently to be explored by those with the courage to venture into unmapped territories of consciousness. As the evening deepened and the fire burned lower, casting ever softer shadows across the familiar room, the three friends sat in comfortable silence, each lost in contemplation of the extraordinary adventure that had brought them together. Outside, London slept under its blanket of fog, dreams rising like gentle mist from millions of sleeping minds, each dream a small exploration of the vast territories of consciousness that Jekyll had learned to navigate with such skill and wisdom. The fog would lift with morning, as it always did, revealing the familiar world transformed by the passage of night into something new and strange and full of possibility. But for now, in the gentle darkness, there was only the quiet satisfaction of work well done, mysteries explored with patience and wisdom, and the deep contentment that comes from knowing that human consciousness, in all its magnificent complexity, continues to evolve and expand toward ever greater expressions of understanding, compassion, and connection. And in that fog-wrapped room, where so many mysteries had been contemplated and so many human puzzles approached with care and wisdom, the story of Jekyll's transformation continued to unfold, not toward final answers, but toward deeper questions, not toward simple resolution, but toward ever-expanding possibility, not toward the end of mystery, but toward the beginning of greater appreciation for the profound complexity and beauty that lives within every human soul. As the months passed into their second year of collaboration, Jekyll's work began to attract attention from unexpected quarters. Letters arrived from distant cities, Edinburgh, Paris, Vienna, from physicians and philosophers who had heard whispers of the remarkable transformations taking place in a quiet London laboratory. Each letter carried the same underlying question. Was it possible that human consciousness could truly be expanded and integrated in the ways that Jekyll's work seemed to suggest? Jekyll approached these inquiries with characteristic thoughtfulness, understanding that his experience carried implications far beyond his personal journey of recovery. Working closely with Dr. Pemberton and a growing circle of collaborators, he began to develop formal protocols for consciousness expansion work, guidelines that could help others explore similar territories safely, gradually and always in service of greater integration rather than mere novelty. "What we're developing here," Jekyll explained to a gathering of visiting researchers one crisp winter morning, "is not a new form of entertainment or escape, but a systematic approach to human development. Consciousness expansion, when approached with proper preparation and support, may represent the next stage in human psychological evolution." The laboratory had been expanded to accommodate the growing interest in Jekyll's work. Additional rooms had been added for individual consultations, group sessions, and research activities. The original chemical apparatus remained, but it was now supplemented by comfortable meeting spaces where people could gather to share experiences and insights, libraries containing works on psychology, philosophy, and consciousness studies, and quiet rooms where individuals could retreat for contemplation and integration. Mrs. Hudson, observing the steady stream of visitors to Jekyll's laboratory from her vantage point at Baker Street, remarked to Watson that she had never seen such a transformation in any person. "Dr. Jekyll," she said while serving afternoon tea, "has become something like a beacon for lost souls, hasn't he? People arrive looking confused and troubled, and they leave with such peace in their faces." Watson nodded, understanding exactly what Mrs. Hudson meant. Jekyll's laboratory had indeed become a place of healing, but healing of a kind that conventional medicine had barely begun to understand. Rather than treating symptoms or suppressing problematic behaviours, Jekyll's approach seemed to help people discover and integrate aspects of themselves they had never known existed. One particularly moving case involved a young artist named Thomas Whitmore, who had been struggling with what conventional medicine termed melancholia, but which Jekyll recognised as a conflict between the artist's creative nature and the practical demands of Victorian society. Through careful work with Jekyll's integration techniques, Whitmore learned to access both his artistic vision and his practical intelligence simultaneously, creating an internal coordination that allowed him to pursue his creative work while maintaining the social connections and practical skills necessary for survival. "Dr. Jekyll didn't cure my melancholia," Whitmore explained to Holmes and Watson during one of their visits to the laboratory. "Instead, he helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't an illness, but a conflict between different aspects of my personality that had never learned to work together. Once I could access both my artistic and practical selves simultaneously, the depression simply dissolved." Such success stories became increasingly common as Jekyll's methods became more refined and his understanding of consciousness integration deepened. People who'd been labelled as hysterical, melancholic, or even mildly insane found that their conditions, when approached as opportunities for development rather than problems to be eliminated, could be transformed into resources for greater creativity, empathy, and life satisfaction. Dr. Pemberton, who had been documenting these cases with scientific rigour, published a series of papers that began to reshape academic understanding of mental health and human potential. Her work, combined with Jekyll's personal example and the growing number of successful cases, attracted the attention of progressive thinkers throughout Europe and America. "What Dr. Jekyll has achieved," wrote Professor Wilhelm Hoffmann of the University of Vienna in a letter that arrived one foggy December morning, "represents a revolution in our understanding of human consciousness. His work suggests that what we have been calling mental illness may often be attempts by the psyche to access and integrate capacities that conventional society has not learned to recognise or support. Such recognition brought both opportunities and challenges. While Jekyll welcomed the growing interest in consciousness development work, he remained deeply concerned about the potential for misuse of the techniques he had developed. His own early experiments had demonstrated how easily consciousness expansion could lead to chaos and fragmentation when attempted without proper preparation and support. The techniques we're developing," Jekyll emphasised during a lecture to visiting physicians, "are not parlour tricks or recreational diversions. They are profound interventions in the fundamental structures of human consciousness, and they require the same level of care and preparation that we would bring to any major surgical procedure." To address these concerns, Jekyll began developing a comprehensive training program for professionals interested in consciousness integration work. The program, which took place over several months and included both theoretical study and supervised practical experience, ensured that those who learned Jekyll's methods would approach them with appropriate wisdom and caution. Holmes, observing the growth of Jekyll's work with characteristic analytical attention, noted how the laboratory had evolved from a place of individual crisis into a centre for collaborative research and development. "What you've created here," he told Jekyll one evening, as they sat by the fire in the expanded laboratory, "is more than a treatment centre. It's a kind of university for consciousness studies, a place where the boundaries of human potential are being explored with scientific rigour and philosophical depth." Jekyll's response reflected the vision that had guided his work from the beginning. "I believe," he said thoughtfully, "that human consciousness is far more malleable and expandable than we have previously imagined. What we're doing here is simply beginning to explore territories that have always existed, but which few people have had the courage or knowledge to navigate safely. As spring arrived with its promise of renewal and growth, Jekyll made an announcement that surprised even his closest collaborators. He had been invited to establish a permanent research institute for consciousness studies, funded by a consortium of progressive philanthropists and academic institutions from across Europe and America. The institute, Jekyll explained to Holmes, Watson and Dr. Pemberton during a private meeting in his laboratory, would allow us to expand our work dramatically. We could train hundreds of professionals in consciousness integration techniques, conduct systematic research into the nature of human psychological potential, and develop applications for education, healthcare, and social reform. The proposal was both exciting and daunting. It represented validation of Jekyll's work on an international scale, but it also meant leaving behind the intimate collaborative environment that had nurtured his own recovery and the development of his methods. Watson, who had grown deeply attached to their small circle of collaboration, felt a mixture of pride and sadness at the prospect of such expansion. "Henry," he said gently, "this represents an extraordinary opportunity to share your gift with the world, but I hope you won't lose sight of the personal connections that made your own recovery possible." Jekyll's response revealed the wisdom he had gained through his journey from fragmentation to integration. "The personal connections," he said warmly, "are not something I could ever leave behind. They're not external to the work. They are the work. Consciousness development, I've learned, is fundamentally about deepening our capacity for authentic connection with others." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, understanding the deeper implications of Jekyll's words. So the Institute would be built around the same principles that guided your own recovery: safety, purpose, and connection. "Exactly," Jekyll confirmed. "We would be creating not just a research facility, but a community of practitioners committed to using consciousness development in service of greater understanding and compassion." The decision to establish the Institute was not made quickly or lightly. Jekyll spent months in consultation with his closest collaborators, carefully considering how to expand his work while preserving the essential qualities that had made it successful. The conversations were deep and thoughtful, often lasting late into the foggy London evenings as they explored the implications of taking consciousness development work to a much larger scale. Dr. Poole, who had witnessed Jekyll's entire journey from crisis to coordination to international recognition, expressed both admiration and concern about the proposed expansion. "Henry," he said during one of their regular evening walks through the fog-wrapped London streets, "you've achieved something truly remarkable. But I worry that success on a large scale might compromise the intimate personal quality that has made your work so effective." Jekyll's response reflected his deep understanding of the delicate balance required for consciousness development work. "The challenge," he said, as they paused beneath a gas lamp that created a warm pool of light in the surrounding mist, "is to scale the work without losing its essential humanity. We can teach techniques and establish protocols, but the heart of the work, the genuine care and connection between people, can't be systematized. It has to be cultivated person by person, relationship by relationship." This insight shaped the planning for the Institute in fundamental ways. Rather than creating a large, centralized facility, Jekyll proposed a network of smaller centers, each maintaining the intimate scale that had proven so crucial for effective consciousness development work. Each center would be staffed by practitioners who had completed the comprehensive training program and demonstrated not just technical competence, but the kind of wisdom and compassion that genuine consciousness work required. As autumn returned, bringing with it the familiar fog that had become such a significant part of their shared story, the plans for the Institute began to take concrete form. Jekyll would remain in London, continuing his work while serving as the coordinating director for the growing network of consciousness development centres. Holmes and Watson would continue their detective work while serving as advisors to the Institute, bringing their unique perspectives on human nature and social dynamics to the expanding enterprise. The evening of Jekyll's final lecture in his original laboratory was marked by a gathering that brought together everyone who had been touched by his work over the past 2 years. The laboratory was filled with people whose lives had been transformed by Jekyll's approach to consciousness integration. Artists who had learned to balance creativity with practicality, physicians who had discovered new approaches to mental health, researchers who had found new directions for their work, and individuals who had simply learned to live more fully and authentically than they had ever imagined possible. Jekyll, standing before this assembled community, spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had travelled far into unmapped territories and returned with gifts for all humanity. "What we have accomplished together," he said, his voice carrying across the fog-filled laboratory, "demonstrates that human consciousness is not a fixed structure to be preserved unchanged, but a dynamic capacity to be developed and expanded in service of greater understanding and connection." He paused, his gaze moving across the faces of people whose lives had been touched by the work they had shared. "The institute we are establishing will carry this work forward, but its success will depend not on buildings or equipment or even techniques, but on the quality of care and connection that each practitioner brings to their work with others." Dr. Pemberton, speaking on behalf of the assembled community, expressed the gratitude they all felt for Jekyll's courage in exploring territories that conventional science had barely acknowledged. "Henry," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you have given us something precious beyond a measure, a new understanding of human potential and the courage to explore aspects of consciousness that we never knew existed." As the evening drew to a close and the fog thickened around the laboratory windows, Jekyll stood with Holmes and Watson in the quiet space where their collaboration had begun. The chemical apparatus that had started his journey into expanded consciousness remained, but it was now surrounded by comfortable chairs, well-worn books, and the accumulated memories of 2 years of transformative work. "I sometimes think," Jekyll said softly, "that my early experiments, chaotic and dangerous as they were, served a purpose I never could have imagined. They forced me to discover resources within human consciousness that I never would have found through conventional means, and they taught me that even the most fragmented experience can be transformed into something beautiful and useful with proper care and support." Watson felt a deep sense of completion as he looked around the laboratory that had been the scene of so much discovery and transformation. "Henry," he said gently, "you've not only survived your journey into expanded consciousness, you've learned to use it as a gift for helping others discover potentials within themselves they never knew existed." Holmes, ever the analyst, but also deeply moved by what they had accomplished together, added his own reflection. "What we've learned through this collaboration," he said thoughtfully, "is that consciousness itself may be the final frontier of human exploration, vast, complex, and full of possibilities we're only beginning to understand." As they prepared to leave the laboratory that had been their shared workspace for so many months, Jekyll made one final observation that captured the essence of what they had discovered together. "The most important thing we've learned," he said as they stood in the doorway looking back at the space where so much transformation had occurred, "is that consciousness development is not a solitary achievement, but a collaborative adventure that requires the support and understanding of genuine community." Outside, the fog had thickened to the point where the gas lamps created only small pools of warm light in the enveloping darkness. As they walked through the muffled streets toward Baker Street, Watson reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a crisis intervention had evolved into a revolutionary understanding of human potential, and what had started as an attempt to help one confused individual had grown into an international movement for consciousness development. At Baker Street they paused before going their separate ways, knowing that while their intensive collaboration was ending, their friendship and shared commitment to consciousness exploration would continue in new forms through the Institute and their ongoing individual work. "Gentlemen," Jekyll said, his voice carrying deep gratitude and affection, "I cannot adequately express what your friendship and collaboration have meant to me. You helped me transform the most frightening experience imaginable into a foundation for serving others, and you've shown me that consciousness expansion, rather than isolating us from humanity, can actually deepen our connections with others in ways I never thought possible." Holmes and Watson exchanged glances, both understanding that they had been privileged to participate in something extraordinary. The exploration of human consciousness at its outer limits, and the discovery that even the most extreme psychological conditions could be transformed into resources for greater wisdom and service. As Jekyll disappeared into the fog-wrapped London night, making his way back to the laboratory, where he would continue his work with a small group of advanced practitioners, while coordinating the expansion of consciousness development centres around the world, Holmes and Watson climbed the familiar stairs to their sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fire was burning low, and Mrs. Hudson had left them a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits. As they settled into their familiar chairs, both men felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done and mysteries explored with patience and wisdom. "Holmes," Watson said as he poured tea for both of them, "do you think we'll ever fully understand what we've witnessed with Jekyll's transformation?" Holmes smiled, an expression of genuine warmth and wonder. "I suspect, Watson, that we've witnessed something that will take generations to fully understand. The beginning of a new chapter in human development. The first systematic exploration of consciousness territories that have always existed, but which few people have had the courage or knowledge to navigate safely." Outside their window, London slept under its blanket of fog, and somewhere in its winding streets, people who had been touched by Jekyll's work were dreaming dreams enriched by their expanded understanding of their own consciousness. The fog would lift with morning, as it always did, revealing a city that looked the same but was somehow different, more mysterious, more full of possibility, more aware of the magnificent complexity that dwells within every human soul. As the evening deepened and the fire burned lower, Holmes and Watson sat in comfortable silence, each lost in contemplation of the extraordinary adventure that had taught them so much about the nature of consciousness, identity, and human potential. They had learned that the boundaries of the possible are far more flexible than most people imagine, that consciousness itself is the greatest mystery and the greatest gift of human existence, and that even the most challenging psychological conditions can be transformed into resources for greater wisdom and compassion when approached with patience, understanding, and genuine care. The fog pressed gently against their windows, and in its soft embrace, London dreamed its ancient dreams of discovery and transformation, of consciousness exploring its own vast territories, of human potential expanding ever outward toward greater expressions of understanding, creativity, and love. And in that fog-wrapped room where so many mysteries had been contemplated and so many human puzzles approached with wisdom and compassion, two friends sat by the dying fire, grateful for the privilege of having witnessed consciousness itself evolving toward greater complexity and beauty, secure in the knowledge that Jekyll's work would continue to unfold in ways they could barely imagine, touching lives and expanding possibilities for generations yet to come. Our story fades into the night, but your presence lingers. Tell us, are you listening from the glowing streets of Dubai, the quiet corners of Amsterdam, or beneath stormy skies in Buenos Aires? Like what you heard? Tap like, hit subscribe, and share the shadows. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay cautious, and drift gently into the dark.